Life has a way of surprising us, usually when we least expect it. And when it does, it's rarely a gentle surprise. For me, it was more like being hit by a wrecking ball when I was at my most vulnerable. And honestly, I didn't deserve it. Let me paint the picture. I was 38 years old, married to Laura for 10 years, and we had two beautiful kids. Emily, 8 and Jake 6. Life wasn't perfect, but it was steady, comfortable. That is, until the universe decided to pull the rug out from under me. One day I got sick. Not just a cold, not a flu, seriously sick. The doctors told me to rest, focus on getting better. But let's be honest. That advice sounds easier than it is when the bills don't take a sick day. At first, Laura was somewhat supportive. She made me soup, though it was the canned kind, and smiled through gritted teeth while reminding me about the growing stack of bills. But patience wears thin quickly when you're under pressure. Within weeks, the subtle cracks started showing. After a month, I noticed she was coming home later. A month later, it wasn't even a secret anymore. One evening, I caught her in the act, slipping out of the house in heels, and a dress that hadn't seen the light of day in years. "Where are you going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Out," she replied, avoiding my gaze. "Out? Why do you care? You're too busy being sick to notice anything else," she snapped. And just like that, she was gone. I didn't need Sherlock Holmes to figure it out. Laura wasn't working late. She was working on someone else, Jack, her personal trainer, the guy with biceps bigger than my thighs and a brain the size of a walnut. A month later, Laura walked out for good. She left me and the kids with nothing but a hastily scribbled note on the fridge. "I need space. Don't try to contact me." Space. She could have just joined NASA for all I cared. At first, I thought I'd feel relief when she left. No more tension. No more arguments about how I wasn't man enough to support the family while fighting a life-threatening illness. But relief never came. Instead, there was just the deafening silence of me. Two kids who didn't understand why mommy wasn't coming home, and a mountain of unpaid bills that seemed to grow every day. Emily was the first to ask, her big brown eyes wide with confusion. "Daddy, when's mommy coming back?" I froze. What do you even say to that? "Sweetie, mommy's just taking some time to figure things out," I stammered, trying not to choke on the lie. Jake, in his 6-year-old wisdom, looked up with a frown. "Can't she figure things out here? We've got lots of space." I ruffled his hair, forcing a smile. "I wish, buddy. I really do." That night, as I sat alone in the dark living room, staring at the note Laura had left behind, the word space echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. Meanwhile, I was barely holding on, just trying to keep the lights on and food on the table. And then, as if the universe wasn't done with me yet, the divorce papers showed up. No warning, no call, just a knock on the door, and there they were. The envelope with Laura's lawyer's name stamped across it. She didn't even care enough to sign the papers herself. She sent her lawyer to do it. I was furious at first, but then I realized something that almost made me laugh. She didn't want to fight me. Not for custody, not for anything. My lawyer drafted the terms, and her lawyer didn't change a word. She didn't want the house, the car, or even the kids. All she wanted was freedom. Well, good riddance, I muttered to myself, signing the papers and sending them back without a second thought. The following months were brutal chemo treatments, part-time work whenever I could muster the strength. Sometimes it felt like I was barely hanging on. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. It gives you a solid foundation to start rebuilding. My friend Chris stepped up in ways I never expected. He helped me land a remote tech consulting job, giving me the flexibility I needed while starting to crawl out of the financial hole Laura left me in. "You're like a phoenix," Chris said one night, after I told him about my new job. "Yeah, but instead of rising from the ashes, I'm just crawling out of debt," I shot back. We both laughed, and for the first time in months it felt real. A year and a half later, life was finally starting to make sense again. Emily and Jake were thriving, I had stable income, and my health was back on track. I even saved enough to take the kids on a little weekend getaway to the mountains, a trip I knew they needed as much as I did. Just when I thought I had seen the last of Laura, she showed up on my doorstep pregnant. It was a Saturday morning. The kids were out back playing, and I had just brewed a cup of coffee, ready to settle in for a quiet day. The doorbell rang, and I opened it expecting to find an Amazon package, but instead there she was. Laura, standing on my doorstep with a suitcase and a belly that was as round as a beach ball. She looked worn out, like life had run her over. And just maybe, Jack's car had something to do with it. Thomas, she said, her voice softer than I remembered. Can we talk? I studied her for a moment. She had that look. The one people wear when they're desperate for something. What do you want, Laura? I asked, my voice steady but cold. I made mistakes, she stammered, her eyes welling up. I know I hurt you. I know I hurt the kids. But I'm here to make things right. I let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Make things right? You mean after you abandoned us for Jack, the meathead? Or does this reunion have more to do with the fact that you're obviously carrying his child, and he probably bailed on you? Her face flushed crimson. She looked down, ashamed. I have nowhere else to go, she whispered. Jack's gone. I've been staying in a motel, but I can't do this alone. Oh, you can't do it alone? I repeated, voice dripping with sarcasm. You ditched me and the kids to play house with Jack. And now, because he's out of the picture, you think you can waltz back in here pregnant, and everything will just go back to normal? I'm their mother, she said, tears streaming down her face. Don't you think they deserve to have me in their lives? Deserve? I echoed, shaking my head. Laura, you haven't earned the right to say that. You abandoned them. You didn't even fight for custody. Remember? You wanted space. Well, congratulations. You've got all the space in the world. And it's going to stay that way. I took a deep breath, trying to rein in the anger bubbling inside me. The kids didn't need to see this. Now, if you'll excuse me, I said, stepping back. I have a life to live. One that doesn't involve you. Goodbye, Laura. I shut the door firmly. Through the window, I saw her stand there for a few moments, before dragging her suitcase down the driveway. I should have felt victorious, but mostly, I just felt tired. A few days later, things took an unexpected turn. Emily came home from school and casually mentioned that Mommy had visited her at Grandma and Grandpa's house. My blood ran cold. What did you just say? I asked, barely holding it together. Mommy came to see us at Grandma and Grandpa's, Emily chirped, twirling a crayon in her hand. We played a game, and she said she missed us. My mind was racing. When did Mommy come to visit? Oh, last weekend, she said, oblivious to the storm brewing. Grandma and Grandpa said it was a surprise. They told us not to tell you. Right. Of course they did. I took a deep breath. Why don't you and Jake set up the Monopoly board? I'll be there in a minute. As soon as they were out of earshot, I grabbed my phone and dialed my mother. What's going on? I demanded. Emily told me Laura's been visiting them. Care to explain? There was a long pause, the kind that makes your stomach churn. She's their mother, Thomas, my mom said, her tone defensive. Since when do you get to decide what my kids deserve? I snapped. I seem to recall you supporting me during the divorce when she abandoned them. She regrets it, Thomas. My dad's voice chimed in from the background. I shook my head, unable to process the absurdity of it all. She regrets it. She bailed on her family, and now, after all this time, she thinks she can waltz back in because she regrets it? No, it doesn't work like that. I couldn't hold it in anymore. She regrets it, huh? I snapped, my voice tight with disbelief. She didn't even bother to fight for custody. She regrets it so much. She's only showing up now that her little fling bailed on her and left her pregnant. Spare me the lecture, Dad. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and my mom's voice softened. That familiar, I'm trying to reason with you, tone creeping in. The kids need a mother. They need a mother. I shot back, my words laced with venom. What they don't need is someone who abandoned them without a second thought. And they sure as hell don't need grandparents sneaking her into their lives behind my back. My words hung in the air, thick with anger. Don't talk to me like that. My dad barked in, his voice full of indignation. We've done nothing but support you. I cut him off, my fury rising. You supported her. You went behind my back to do it. You betrayed me, and you betrayed my kids. My tone grew more venomous. Don't you dare twist this around. The silence on the other end was deafening, broken only by their shallow breaths. They couldn't find a response, and I wasn't about to let them off the hook. This stops now, I said, my voice firm and resolute. You're done letting her see the kids. And if you ever pull this stunt again, I'll make sure you never see them either. Do I make myself clear? Do I make myself clear? I repeated, giving them no room for argument. Fine, my mom whispered, her voice barely audible. Good, I replied, hanging up before they could say another word. My hands were shaking as I set the phone down, but the anger felt strangely liberating. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me anymore. That night, after the kids were asleep, I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. Restraining order, I said without hesitation. He let out a low whistle. Against your ex-wife, I assume? Yep, I replied. And my parents, too. There was a pause. Your parents? They've been letting her see my kids behind my back, I explained, my voice cold. I'm done playing nice. The next morning, I walked into my lawyer's office with more resolve than I had felt in a long time. Scott, my attorney, was the kind of guy who didn't believe in sugarcoating anything. He sat back in his chair, arms crossed, as I laid out the whole sordid mess. So let me get this straight, he said, raising an eyebrow. Your ex-wife abandoned her kids, showed up pregnant by some other guy, and now your parents are secretly letting her see them? Bingo, I confirmed, crossing my arms. And you wanted to stop? Yesterday? Exactly, I said, my voice unwavering. Scott let out a low whistle. Man, your life's like a bad soap opera. No offense. None taken, I replied dryly. Now, how do we make this happen? Over the next week, Scott worked tirelessly, drafting the necessary documents for a restraining order against Laura. He also outlined the steps to limit my parents' contact with the kids, if they didn't fall in line. Scott was a shark in the courtroom, and I trusted him to handle this mess. I braced myself for the fallout. I knew my parents wouldn't sit quietly, and Laura was far from done with her games. The first shot came 3 days later, when my mom showed up uninvited. Thomas, she began, her tone a mix of indignation and disappointment. How could you do this to us, to your own parents? I stood in the doorway, blocking her from stepping inside. You mean, how could I try to protect my kids from the woman who abandoned them? I said, my voice steady but sharp. Pretty easily, actually. She huffed, clutching her purse like it held the moral high ground. We were only trying to help. Laura deserves a second chance. I couldn't contain the bitterness in my laugh. Second chance? Mom, she's on like her 5th chance, and every single time, she's managed to screw it up. You don't get to make that call. At least, not with my kids. She's their mother. My mom snapped, her face flushed with frustration. She's the woman who gave birth to them, and then walked out. I shot back. Big difference. My dad, who had been waiting in the car, finally decided to join the conversation. You're being unreasonable, Thomas. We're their grandparents. We have a right to see them. Sure, I said, shrugging nonchalantly. As long as you're not acting as Laura's secret accomplices. But you crossed that line. And now you're dealing with the consequences. Consequences? My mom repeated, her voice rising. You're seriously going to cut us out of your life over this? No, I said, stepping forward and lowering my voice. You cut yourselves out when you decided Laura's feelings were more important than my kids' safety. They stood there speechless, as I closed the door slowly behind me. I wasn't slamming it, I was done with the drama. A week later, we were in court. Laura showed up, playing the part of the wronged woman. But it didn't work. Scott tore through her defense like a hot knife through butter. Every lie she tried to spin, every excuse she made, he countered with cold, hard facts. By the time the judge handed down the restraining order, Laura's face was a mix of rage and defeat. As for my parents, they didn't even show up. Maybe they realized they couldn't win this fight. Or maybe they just couldn't face me. Either way, the restraining order applied to them too. And I made it clear I wasn't backing down. That evening, as I sat on the couch with Emily and Jake, watching their favorite movie, I finally felt some peace. Sure, there was still work to do, therapy sessions, rebuilding trust. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were okay. And then, just as I started to think life had finally calmed down, the phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. Curious, I answered. Hi, is this Thomas? A warm, slightly nervous voice asked. Yes, this is he, I replied, unsure. This is Sophie from Jake's school, she continued. I think he left his jacket here. And I just wanted to make sure you knew. Oh, great, I said, trying not to sound too flustered. I'll swing by tomorrow to pick it up. No problem, she said. And if you ever need help with anything, let me know. My son really likes Jake. I think they're becoming good friends. I hung up, a small smile creeping across my face. Maybe, just maybe, life wasn't done surprising me yet. The next morning, I dropped the kids off at school and decided to swing by Sophie's classroom to pick up Jake's jacket. When I walked in, I didn't know what to expect, but I certainly didn't expect her standing by the chalkboard, helping a group of kids with an art project. Her long brown hair was tied back, and there was a softness in her eyes that immediately put me at ease. Mr. Thomas, one of the kids yelled, pointing at me like I was a celebrity. Sophie turned, her smile widening when she saw me. You must be Jake's dad, she said, walking over with the jacket in hand. Guilty, I said, smiling back. And you must be Sophie, the jacket rescuer. She laughed, a soft, genuine sound that I hadn't realized I needed to hear. It's all in a day's work. Jake's a great kid, by the way. Always helping out his friends. That's all him, I said. I just try to keep him from eating crayons. She laughed again, and for a moment I forgot about everything else. Laura, the restraining order, my parents. It was just nice. Over the next few weeks, Sophie and I kept running into each other. First at a school event where Jake and her son Max were performing in a little play. Then at the park, where the kids had somehow orchestrated a playdate without telling us. By the third coincidental meeting, it was clear the kids were up to something. Do you think they're plotting against us? I joked as we watched them climb the jungle gym. Absolutely, she said, sipping her coffee. Max told me yesterday that I should smile more, because Mr. Thomas is funny. Great, I said, rolling my eyes. I'm being set up by a 6-year-old. She laughed, and this time I joined in. It felt good, light, easy, something I hadn't felt in years. Eventually, one thing led to another, and we decided to have a proper dinner together. Not a date, of course. Just two parents whose kids got along. At least, that's how I justified it to myself. That night, as Sophie and Max came over, I couldn't help but notice how natural it all felt. Emily and Jake were thrilled to have their new friends over. And Sophie fit into the chaos of my house like she'd always been part of it. After the kids were tucked in, Sophie and I sat on the porch sipping tea. The night air was cool, but comfortable. You know, she said, looking out at the stars. It had been a long time since I'd had much to laugh about. And I said so with a bit of awkwardness. Sophie's gaze softened as she nodded, understanding more than I expected. I get that, she said, her voice gentle. Being a single parent isn't easy, but I want you to know, you're doing an amazing job. Your kids are lucky to have you. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I simply nodded and took another sip of my tea, trying to hide the lump forming in my throat. After a long pause, I turned the conversation around. And you? I asked, genuinely curious. How are you holding up? Sophie smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting both sadness and strength. Some days are harder than others. Losing my husband, it wasn't easy, but Max keeps me going. And honestly, it's nice to have people around who understand. She paused, her gaze meeting mine with a quiet intensity. For the first time in a long time, I felt something stirring in my chest, hope. Dating again had felt strange at first, like trying to ride a bike after years of walking everywhere. But with Sophie it was different. She wasn't flashy or overbearing. She was warm, kind, and effortlessly made everything seem lighter. Her presence felt like a balm to my weary heart. Our first official date took place at a cozy Italian restaurant downtown. And I'll admit, I was nervous. The last time I had been on a date, MySpace was still a thing and Facebook was only just emerging. As I knocked on her door to pick her up, I found myself smiling despite the nerves. You look great, I said, genuinely meaning it. She was wearing a simple blue dress that perfectly complemented her eyes, and her smile had the power to make everything feel all right. Thanks, she said, grinning. You clean up pretty well yourself. Dinner was nothing like I expected. No awkward silences or awkward mishaps with food. Just easy conversation and plenty of laughs. We talked about our kids, how Emily was obsessed with dinosaurs, and how Jake's latest project involved trying to build a rocket out of cardboard. Sophie shared stories of Max's endless curiosity and her late husband's wicked sense of humor. By the end of the night, it felt like we had known each other forever. A couple of dates later, we decided to take the kids on a picnic. Sophie suggested it, and the kids were absolutely thrilled. We spent the afternoon at a park by the lake, where Jake and Max competed to see who could skip rocks the farthest, while Emily tried to teach Sophie the names of every dinosaur she could remember. As we sat on the blanket watching them, Sophie leaned over, her voice soft and content. "You know," she said, "this feels right." I smiled back at her, my heart light for the first time in what felt like forever. "Yeah, it really does." Things moved quickly after that. Sophie and Max began spending more time at our house, and it was only a matter of time before I asked her to move in with me. One night, while the kids were tucked in, I looked over at Sophie and said, "You know, I think it's time. Will you move in with us?" Her expression softened, and she hesitated, her eyes searching mine. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice full of uncertainty. I nodded firmly. "Absolutely. The kids adore you. I adore you. It feels like you've been part of this family from the very start." She smiled, and that was it. Sophie and Max moved in, and for the first time in years, my house felt like a home. But life has a way of testing you just when things are going well. One evening, as Sophie and I were putting the kids to bed, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a friend. "Hey, just heard Laura had her baby. As far as I know, your parents are helping her a lot, including financially. Thought you'd want to know." I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Laura's drama had been blissfully absent for months, but now there was a newborn in the picture, and I could already sense trouble on the horizon. The next day, Emily came home from school with a strange story. "Daddy, guess who I saw today?" she said, dropping her backpack with excitement. "Who?" I asked, already bracing myself. "Mommy," she replied, her face a mixture of confusion and concern. She was in the parking lot, but Mr. James wouldn't let her talk to us. He said she wasn't allowed. Mr. James, the school principal, had been briefed on the restraining order, and I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief. But at the same time, something in my gut told me this wasn't over. That evening I called my parents. "Care to explain why Laura is back in the picture?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. "And how do I know you're still helping her with everything?" There was a long pause before my mom responded, her voice shaking. "Thomas, she's struggling." Her maternal instincts were awakened, and she tried to see Emily at school. As for our help, she has a newborn and no one to help her. We couldn't just turn her away. I pinched the bridge of my nose, trying to stay calm. "She's struggling? Mom, she left me when I was sick and broke. She abandoned her kids, and now you're playing savior." "She's pregnant," my mom said quietly. "And your father had a dream. He believes it was a sign from God to help her." "A dream? Seriously?" "Yes," my dad chimed in. "In the dream, I saw her alone crying, holding her stomach. It felt like a message we couldn't ignore." I let out a long sigh, feeling the weight of their religious beliefs press down on me. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I get that you think you're doing the right thing, but when it comes to my kids, I'm the one who decides what's right. And Laura, she doesn't get to waltz back into their lives whenever she feels like it. Are we clear?" My mom sniffled, her voice trembling. "We're sorry, Thomas. Truly, we just felt like we had to do something." "Well, don't," I said firmly. "She made her choices and so have I. This is my family now, and I won't let her ruin it again." Later that week, Laura tried one last stunt, showing up at our house with her baby in tow. I didn't even let her finish her sob story before cutting her off. "Laura, leave now, or the next call I make will be to the police." Her face fell, but I didn't flinch. Without another word, she turned and left. That night, as Sophie and I sat on the couch, she reached for my hand. "You okay?" she asked softly. "Yeah," I said, squeezing her hand. "I'm more than okay. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm finally in control." The next few months were blissfully quiet. Laura didn't attempt to contact me or the kids, and for the first time in years, I felt like we could breathe. Life with Sophie was everything I had hoped for, peaceful, full of love and steady. Emily and Jake were thriving, and even Max had started calling me Mr. T, which always made us all laugh. Then one afternoon my phone buzzed. It was my dad. "Hey Dad. Everything okay?" I asked, expecting the usual small talk. "Thomas," he began, his voice unusually serious. "I wanted to let you know that Laura won't be bothering you anymore. She's moving out of town." I felt a wave of relief, but I stayed quiet, waiting for the inevitable but. Sure enough, it came. "But," he said, "I think you should forgive her. Maybe not now, but someday. And maybe, just maybe, you could let her see the kids." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Dad, we've been over this. She gave up that right when she left them." He responded softly. "Forgiveness is a cornerstone of faith, Thomas. You can't carry this grudge forever." I knew this was coming. My dad couldn't resist throwing in a religious angle. "Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us," he quoted. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I get it really. But my priority is protecting my kids. Maybe someday when they're older, we can revisit this. But not now. Not this year." My answer is no. There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear him sigh. "You're a good man, Thomas. I just hope you can find it in your heart to let go of this anger." "I'll think about it," I said, though I wasn't sure I meant it. "But it's my decision, and I'm sticking to it for now." Later that night, after Sophie and the kids had gone to bed, I sat alone on the couch, replaying the conversation in my head. Forgiveness, was that really the answer? Or was it just another way of letting Laura off the hook for everything she'd done? I still don't know. Maybe my dad was right. Maybe forgiveness is the key to moving on. But it's not just about me. It's about Emily and Jake. They